Scrapper Candy writes, I'm decidedly a B-side scrapper. Give me a stripe or a polka dot and I can scrap all day long. But I have all these lovely florals or other bold pattern papers sitting in my stash just waiting to be scrapped, and I can't do it. I never know where to start. Glitter Girl, can you help Scrapper Candy conquer her A-side anxiety?
Of course I can. One of the things to keep in mind with bold pattern papers is that you can always use just part of the sheet or use the whole sheet and cover up some of the design to make it a little less bold than the 12 by 12 sat in front of you. So this week I've actually done a little something different, and I've created a PDF full of sketches that work really well with bold pattern papers, and I'm going to take you through a few examples. This one is digital, but the entire idea is that the bold pattern paper is there in the background, but the red paper separates the bold design from the photos so that everything is still really clear, and that red paper takes up about a third of the page. Thirds is something that comes in handy with bolder patterns all the time. So in this case, the wood grain pattern in the background takes up about 2/3 of the page, and then there's 1/3 of that bold A-side cupcake print at the bottom. And the same design could work with the full page, but with just a third, it takes your attention more to the photos and the writing and less to looking at, oh, that's a really gorgeous sheet of paper. Here I've used another 1/3 of the page design with that bold floral print at the right-hand side, but there's more to the rest of the page. So there's 2 photos. There's still quite a lot of detail in that bottom left quadrant of the page. But by taking that bold pattern and putting it in a strip that's just a third of the page, and then not really putting much on top of it, it allows you to appreciate the full pattern without it overwhelming everything else that's on the layout. So that can actually balance all the other little details on the plainer pattern. But here's the bold design that takes up 2/3 of the page instead of just 1/3, so it does work in the other direction as well. But you'll notice that the top of the bold pattern, there's a lot covering it up, and so you see just the pattern itself in the bottom half of the page. This sort of design can work with a pattern paper that you really want to show the pattern, and it works well for those oddball photos where you only have one image to scrapbook because there aren't any other pictures that go with that one image. Here's another way. This is less about thirds and more about separating the pattern. So there's all sorts of different patterns on this page, but each one is matted in a solid darker color so that they're all separated from each other on the layout. And then the bolder pattern is there at the center, but everything layers on top of it. So the photo is on top, the embellishments are on top of that bolder pattern, the title's on top, so that it kind of gets pushed into the background quite literally. But of course, there are other ways. In fact, things like this where you take lots of different bold patterns and then cut them up. That white and pink pattern at the bottom left with the bold peacock is something that on a 12 by 12 sheet, I really wouldn't know what to do with. But cut down into a smaller piece, I thought it worked really well with other patterns like florals and polka dots. So there's a mix here of A sides and B sides, some bold patterns and some that are a bit more subtle. And you can use a sketch like this with all sorts of scraps too, which makes it really good for busting your leftovers. Here's a bold pattern that you don't really notice once the page is done. The paper that has the polka dots and the wood grain and that floral, that's all a pattern paper, or a fabric paper. But I've put it on the bottom half of the page, and it's the background layer. So on its own, as a 12 by 12 sheet, it was quite intimidating because there was so much printed on that, and it wasn't just one pattern all over the whole sheet. But by taking it down to the bottom half of the page and leaving that embellishment in the bottom corner, then it works like an embellishment rather than an overwhelming paper. Another design I really like is to use a square. So you have the 12 by 12 page and then a 10 by 10 square of something else that you layer on. And you can do this in either way. So here, the 12 by 12 is the really bold pattern in the background, but then that's broken up with that 10 by 10 square of white paper so that I can then add more things on top, and my photos aren't competing against that really crazy bold paisley because the white is there to balance it. And here there's a really bold, crazy stripe at the 12 by 12, but the green grid in the 10 by 10 square is a lot more subtle, and that means that I can build on top of that and have that layer in between to divide the crazy bold A side from the photos and the other things that I want your attention to go to. So that's what I'm going to take you through today, a page using a mix of patterns, including a really bold A side, using this technique of a 12 by 12 and a 10 by 10 square. I'm starting with papers from the Crate Paper Heart collection, which was a Valentine's Day collection, but there are lots of things in it that aren't particularly cupids and hearts and all sorts of things like that. And this is what I mean by a bold A side. Here's this really big, bright floral. But on the back side, or the B side of the paper, there's a really subtle lined print. So oftentimes I would just use that subtle version, but today I'm going to use that bold floral. Now I'm going to mix it with another paper from the same collection, and this time the bold bit is on the back, and I really wouldn't want to use these two together. The hearts and the flowers, it's just too much. But if I use the wood grain to balance the craziness or the big bold pattern, then I can get a look that I'll really like. So I'm going to keep that 12 by 12 wood grain sheet as my background, and then I'm going to cut the bolder A side, the floral pattern, to a 10 by 10 square. So this is a lot like the two pages I just showed you, except I'm reversing the technique. So instead of putting that bold pattern in the background and putting something paler on top, I'm starting with the more neutral shade as the 12 by 12 and cutting the bold pattern down to 10 by 10. And to keep everything matching, I'm just going to add brown ink on all the edges. Now, this technique also works well with matting the 10 by 10 squares. You could cut a mat that's 10.5 by 10.5, or even just a little bit smaller. And that will, if you cut that in something like a dark brown or a black, a navy cardstock, you can add a bit more of a definitive frame to that 10 by 10 in the middle. So just get that adhered, and then I can start to look at the other elements of this page. When I cut the 10 by 10 square, then I'm left with two strips where I could use that more subtle B-side pattern on the paper. So I'm taking the 12-inch strip and inking that, and I'm just going to cut a little bit off the edge so that I can leave a bit of the wood grain frame around the full page. And this strip at the bottom of the page will then give me good grounding to be able to add all the other elements on top of the page and have a horizontal element to kind of keep everything in the right sort of spot. So I could use my two photos. I'm using two 4x6 pictures. I could put them straight onto the bold pattern paper, but I prefer in cases like this to use a really small, subtle mat. So I could use cardstock, but I also had this subtle tone-on-tone swirl pattern from Echo Park, and it was a really good match to the pink. And I like the idea that the textures then would be the same because they're both pattern papers rather than the different texture I would get from the cardstock. So I went ahead and cut a mat that's small on three sides with just a little bit more room at the bottom, and just to give me another spot for some embellishment and maybe the title. So I'll go ahead and adhere that block, and I can move it around and see where is going to be the best balance. But I liked this position where I have just a tiny bit of the bold pattern showing at the left-hand side of the photo. Now I wanted to add something that's not square, so I'm going with this scallop border sticker, and that's from the Echo Park Note to Self collection. And I don't want to use the full 12-inch strip, so I'm just going to cut off two of the scallops, and then I can run it just underneath the bottom edge of the two photographs, so that now I have something that's a bit more fluid and round and curved, rather than all those straight square lines that are all over the rest of the design so far. Another kind of bold A-side is when you get a design like this that's actually all sorts of separate little items that you could cut apart. So this one is from Note to Self, and it has lots of tickets. There's a similar idea in the Polaroid sheet in the Dear Lizzie collection. And when I look at that, I tend to think I will cut those apart and treat them almost as different die cuts. So I've chosen a few different tickets for this page, and I've put one longer strip at the bottom left of the photo, and then created a cluster of them at the top right with the tickets and then some journaling stickers to give a little grouping there. And they're going diagonal across the photo so that I have the pictures in the center of the two layers of embellishment. And then I'm going to add the title below the photo and below that border sticker. Again, I'm using supplies from Note to Self, and I'm just going to gently tack down each letter so that I can make sure that everything is going to fit in the space where I want it to be before I commit to having everything completely stuck to that background. And I tend to spell out my titles backwards if I know where I want the word to end and there's going to be room going back. So that can make the spacing a little easier. But do make sure that if you're spelling something complicated, you might want to write it down and follow it back, because I find that when I'm spelling backwards, sometimes my spelling can get a little bit creative. And here's that page all finished. I used the Amy Tangerine white wood grain letters to finish the title, and then also used the little asterisk stickers to kind of bring that the title lettering in with the embellishment. And you could add more to this if you like a really busy style. You could throw in buttons and brads and paint and all sorts, or you can keep it simple. You could even pull it back simpler than this and get rid of the cluster at the top. This week, I hope you'll create something with an A-side that's perhaps a bold pattern that's been challenging you a bit, and I'd love to see your work in the gallery at 2 Peas in a Bucket.
Join us next week for the continuing adventures of Glitter Girl and the ongoing mystery of the scrapbooker behind the mask at 2peasinabucket.com.